All right, we're going to look at three distinguishing characteristics of hominids. So there's more than this, but these are the three that we're going to focus on for this introductory to biological anthropology class. So we're going to look at bipedalism first, and then the next video will be about the skull, which they're not distinct from one another necessarily, because much of the morphology associated with the skull is also associated with bipedal locomotion. And then finally, we'll look at culture in the third video. And that should be what we're going to cover for this unit, or for this week's material, this week's lesson. All right, so bipedalism. So bipedalism is the act of walking on two legs. And out of the primates, humans are the only obligate bipeds. And to be an obligate biped means like you're obligated. You have to walk on two legs. We evolved two-legged walking. Try to walk around in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, and you will find very quickly that that is not a way to move around. It is uncomfortable. And a lot of the morphology that we have is associated with bipedal locomotion. Yes, chimpanzees and gorillas can walk on two legs, but this is not their primary means of locomotion. And we'll look at an example here in a second of differences in energy expenditure associated with bipedal locomotion. Gibbons, another ape, when they're on the ground, they walk bipedally. But gibbons often, very rarely do they go on the ground. Most of the times, gibbons are moving through the trees, doing what's called brachiating, swinging like you're on the monkey bars. So just some examples to begin with. If we look here in this, the picture of the pelvis, the two pelvises here, on the left-hand side is a human pelvis. You'll notice that it is very wide. I get my handy-dandy drawer out. You'll notice that it is very wide and very short. And its shape, it's hard to see in a two-dimensional picture, but it's shaped like a bowl. So the iliac crests arch around the front like this. And what that does is it creates lots of locations on the pelvis for muscle attachments, ligament attachments, etc., that facilitate upright locomotion. On the right here, you can see a chimpanzee pelvis. You can see that it's very tall, but it's very narrow. And the iliac crests are flat. They do not curve forward because the pelvis is angled forward. And so really the guts are hanging from the pelvis. But a lot of the locomotion doesn't, a lot of the muscles and ligaments and stuff don't need to attach for locomotion on the pelvis. And so one of the reasons, for instance, humans have painful childbirth is due to adaptations associated with bipedal locomotion. Changes in the pelvis, which we see pretty early on in species like Australopithecus afarensis. We see a more kind of a bowling shaped pelvis, where the pelvis is becoming more bowl shaped. It's certainly more short, and this is associated with bipedal locomotion. We also have more fossils than just their pelvises, and we actually have Australopithecus afarensis footprint, so we know that they're bipedal. But their pelvises look much more similar to our pelvises than they do to chimpanzee pelvises. Chimpanzee pelvises are there to serve their function for locomotion and the things that they're doing. Our pelvises are adapted to bipedal locomotion. And it's not just the pelvises. We can look at our lower limb bones, in particular, in this case, the femur. That's your upper thigh bone. And you can see here, comparing a gorilla leg to a human leg, you can see that gorilla, let me change the color of this. You can see that gorilla femurs are perpendicular to the ground, as in the femur angles straight down to the ground at a 90-degree angle, whereas the femur of humans and also most hominids angle inward. And what this does is, if you think about the center of gravity here, and you'll see this in a video we'll watch here in a second. Right? When the femurs are straight down, vertical with the ground, what this means is that center of gravity, every time they step, is rotating left and right and left and right. So a lot of the energy that's used to move walking bipedally for gorillas and chimpanzees gets wasted in kind of this side-to-side sway. But when the femurs are angled inward toward the center, towards that line right there of the center of gravity, most of the energy is forward and backward. And as a matter of fact, when you're walking forward, it is mostly forward, and you lose very little in side-to-side rotation. Now, this is also offset by how we swing our arms and how our torsos move when we walk. And yet again, the video we look at here in a second will further illustrate that. But nonetheless, that is a huge factor for bipedal locomotion. We can look at the skull and compare the location of the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum, where's my human skull? The foramen magnum, foramen means hole. So you have like, you have mandibular foramen. These are where blood vessels come out. You have supraorbital foramen, where these blood vessels come out. Foramen just means hole. Foramen magnum like magnum condoms, means big hole, right? So the big hole in the bottom of the skull. So the location of this hole. And so if you compare this to quadrupedal animals like chimpanzees who walk on all fours, now more at an angle, less like a dog, or you compare it to a wolf or a baboon, you'll be able to see that the foramen magnum of humans are anterior. They're more forward than you see the other. And this is because our heads sit directly on top of our spines instead of hanging out off the end of our spines. It's directly underneath it. And this affects the force on the skull and on the neck, of course. And we can look kind of further down at the spine, and what we can see is if we compare a gorilla spine to a human spine, we have a much more curved spine. Gorilla spines are straight because gorilla spines are in this angle, right? This is the skull. You got to give them big canines, legs, arms, walking on the knuckles. All right, so gorillas walk in this posture. Humans, we walk in this posture. So when we're walking, we're moving our body. So all the weight, the mass of your body is going straight down into the ground. So all that mass of your torso has to go up and down as you walk. And that causes compression. And so gorillas and chimpanzees do not have spinal anatomy to support a lot of up and down motion, right? It's going to constantly crush their vertebrae, and it's just inefficient. Humans, we have this S shape to our spine. And what that does is it serves like the shocks on a car, right? So it's like a spring. Every time we walk, all that weight kind of compresses the spine, but instead of compressing it directly through the vertebrae, it just flexes the vertebrae a little bit. So these curves end up flexing just like the shocks of a car. And so it's dissipating or absorbing a lot of that energy due to the movement of the mass of your body. So it makes bipedal locomotion highly effective. As a matter of fact, bipedal locomotion in humans is one of the most energy efficient forms of locomotion that we know of. Another thing with humans, it's pretty obvious when you compare us to other primates, is our convergent big toe. Right? Convergent in line with, so if you look here, our big toes are in line with our other toes. But if you look at gorillas, chimpanzees, tarsiers, they have divergent big toes. They diverge from the other toes. So our convergent big toes, one, affects how ligaments and stuff attach, which make our feet absorb energy so that when we're walking, like our Achilles tendon, which connects down here and runs up the back of the leg, those serve as a similar function to the tail of a kangaroo. When kangaroos are hopping, there's a huge ligament in their tail, and it stores energy every time they leap, and then when they jump, it releases that energy, and then it stores it and releases it, stores it, releases it, which means it's very energy efficient. And so, one, keeping the big toe from hanging off the side of the feet is efficient when you're putting pretty much all of your weight on these two limbs, but also it allows for ligament attachments in the foot that absorb, or rather store energy and then release it as we're walking to just make our bipedal locomotion much more efficient. So let's look at an example really quickly of what that looks like comparing chimpanzees to humans and helping us make sense of what we might think Australopithecines' bipedal locomotion might be like.
This is Hercules. He's supposed to be walking in a nice straight line, but actually he's just monkeying around. Hercules is one of two chimps helping scientists understand the origins of human walking. This is what humans look like when they walk. To keep track of the body's movements, researchers stuck markers on specific points of their subjects and traced their position. And this is Hercules' colleague Leo taking a stroll. Clearly pretty different to his human counterpart. Chimps swing their hips much more than humans when they walk. By tracing the markers, the researchers were able to analyze these differences. When humans walk, we swing our ribs in the opposite direction to our hips, which helps us to save energy. From looking at their skeletons, chimps' torsos appear to be too rigid to make this movement possible. But, surprisingly, Hercules and Leo's bodies do twist a little as they walk. You can see their ribs move in the same direction as their hips, but they are cancelling out some of the motion. These two walking styles may still seem pretty different, but if you hold the hips still, you can see that the ribs are still compensating by the same amount in both humans and chimps. These chimp results imply that human ancestors, like Australopithecus, might also have walked more dynamically than we previously thought. Who would have thought that Hercules strutting his stuff on a catwalk could teach us so much?
So what you're seeing here is when chimpanzees walk, their hips and their torso swing the same direction. And what that means is as you take one step, if you swing this way, some of your energy is going off to the side. It's not straight in line with the locomotion, right? The direction of movement. Whereas humans, when we walk, our hips and our shoulders, our hips and our torsos rotate in opposite directions, which keeps us more on that center line, which means that as we're moving forward, most of our energy expenditure is for driving forward, not for compensating for that kind of loss of energy to the side as we rotate. And so we look at another study. This is looking at oxygen. So you put a mask on chimpanzees and humans and you have them walk and run. And so this is done in a laboratory. The yellow dots here are for humans and the blue and red dots are for chimpanzees. The red dots are chimpanzees walking bipedally on two legs, and then the blue dots are chimpanzees walking quadrupedally, so walking as they normally would walk, knuckle walking. This is running. They also have data for walking. They tell the same story, but running is the one I picked to show here for whatever reason. Had to pick one. And so what you can see here is if we look at the X and a Y axis, the X axis is body mass. And so what we can see is the body mass for humans and chimpanzees that were tested in this are pretty similar to one another because obviously bigger bodies are going to cost more energy to move. So they wanted to control for that variable as much as possible. And on the Y axis, we have energy expenditure. So how much energy does it cost to move that body in this particular way? The higher you go on the y-axis, the more energy is being expended. And so what you can see here is there is a huge, substantial difference in the amount of energy it costs for humans to move bipedally than it does for either chimpanzees to walk bipedally or for chimpanzees to walk the typical way they walk by knuckle walking. So bipedal locomotion is much more efficient than either quadrupedal locomotion for chimpanzees or bipedal locomotion for chimpanzees. And this tells us a lot about how humans evolved and the selection pressures acting on humans as we're evolving. We are walkers. That's what we do. And when we look at the fossil record, when we look at ecological evidence, what we see is that humans are moving around a lot. We are moving over long distances. And so it makes sense that given what we see in the fossil record, we're going to see the evolution of this much more energy efficient form of locomotion. So there, why the question then is why does bipedalism evolve? So chimpanzees and gorillas both knuckle walk. So they walk on the knuckles of their forelimbs, their arms, right? So they walk like this. And it seems so. There's kind of two hypotheses for that. One hypothesis is the common ancestor of gorillas and chimpanzees and humans were knuckle walkers. And then the other hypothesis is that knuckle walking evolved independently in both gorillas and chimpanzees. It seems that that's the second one is probably more likely given what we know about early hominins. Early hominins are arboreal, they're living in trees, and they're moving through the trees using a form of brachiation. We can see this in early hominin fossils like Ardipithecus ramidus and Ardipithecus cadava, who seem to be moving through the trees in this upright posture, similar to how gibbons move through the trees. And we know that when gibbons come down on the ground, they walk bipedally because as they're moving through the trees, they're already in this vertical motion. So they have these, so the idea is then that early hominins had this pre-adaptation to bipedal locomotion. So it's just a matter of translating that from the trees down onto the ground. So one of the things that we do know is that the evolution of bipedalism is occurring alongside shifting environments. And there are three major hypotheses. The first is, and the oldest is the savanna hypothesis, which is basically as Africa started drying out due to the rise of the Himalayan mountains and the formation of the North and South poles, which with that glaciation pulled moisture out of the air and therefore resulted in drying. And then the Himalayas blocked that cool, moist air from traveling south from more northerly latitudes down into North and East Africa, which is where our early ancestors are evolving. The issue with this is certainly the savannas played a huge role in the evolution of bipedalism, but there's this assumption in the savanna hypothesis that that the regions of Africa in which our early ancestors are evolving in are just transforming from these tropical rainforests into these more open savannas, and that's simply not backed up by the evidence. So we can look at pollen grains, we can look at soil samples, we can look at ocean core, we can core out ocean sediments and look at that, and it gives us an idea about climate and about the sorts of plants that are occupying particular ecosystems during times. And it can tell us about, temperature fluctuations and all sorts of things. And so when we look at that, we don't see this smooth transition to savannas. The kinds of pollen that we're seeing shift drastically over time really rapidly, and dissolved oxygen and other evidence in ocean core samples tell a slightly different story. Another hypothesis is the turnover pulse hypothesis, and this is the climate change that's driving the drying out of the region in which our ancestors are evolving, is associated with this high faunal turnover. So there's lots of extinctions or lots of species that are no longer living in particular areas because they're not habitable. And yet again, this is true to a degree, whereas we see shifts in fossil patterns. So we see fossils associated with grazers, right? So we see more kind of bovine fossils, antelope fossils that are associated with more open savannas. Yet again, there's more to the story than that. And so the third is called the variability selection hypothesis. And this tries to account for what we see in paleoclimate data, which is that there are these fluctuations in climate and in the environment that hominins are having to contend with over time. And so basically, the different hypotheses we looked at, either you've got a stable habitat, we know we can just reject that one because the habitat's not stable. There's no evidence that the habitats of North and Eastern Africa are stable. They're shifting. The progressive habitat change, that is assuming that there is a smooth transition, at least over a particular scope of time, in which you've got this transition from tropical rainforest to open savanna. The variability hypothesis is actually there's this kind of swinging that's happening in these short periods of time. And so we can look at that. We can look at how, sorry, I'm pulling my pen up. We can look at how climate is shifting in these areas over time. So the x-axis is going to be millions of years. This is 9 million years ago over here on the right. This is today. And this is 018. As you go up on the y-axis, this indicates a warmer climate. And then as you go down on the y-axis, that indicates a colder climate. So if we go back in time, we see that things are mostly stable. So hominins start diversifying and splitting off from the chimpanzee, the pan lineage, somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago. And we see that before that, if we did a linear regression, here, I'll just eyeball it. What you're going to see are pretty smooth transitions, but for the most part, it's pretty stable over this period of time. But then at about 6 million years ago, if we start drawing these lines, and again, we see that the peaks and valleys of the major lines are pretty close together, especially during this kind of first 2 million year range when you've got Ardipithecines, Sahelanthropines, Kenyanthropines evolving. But the thing that's most telling and I think most interesting about this is look at the distance between the peaks and the valleys here, right? There are these slow transitions. When the peaks and valleys are really far apart from one another, that tells us there's a slow transition from warmer to cooler. But as we start getting to about 6 million years ago, we go from these nice kind of smooth gradients into much more erratic swings. And then if we look at the peaks and the valleys in terms of how much distance there is between peaks and valleys, right? They're pretty small here. But look, once we start getting about 6 million years ago, they start to get bigger and bigger until today. Well, more recently, there are these huge swings in these very short periods of time, which means that climate and habitat and food and all of that is much more unpredictable, which itself is selection pressure, right? It's putting evolutionary pressure on populations to be able to accommodate these sorts of huge swings. And of course, today we've had this huge swing up to the warm side due to anthropogenic climate change. And so this is happening along the same time that we're seeing all sorts of stuff, bipedalism, lots of traits that we associate with hominins. But we also see it associated with increase in cranial capacity. So increase in brain size, basically. So where we see the most fluctuation, so I'm going to draw it back out, where we see the most fluctuation, let's go white. And this kind of last 800, why is it not drawing? Because it's frozen. Anyways, if you look here into the red, where there's the most fluctuation, there it goes. My camera's freezing, I think that's what it's doing. Where you see the kind of most fluctuations, where the peaks and valleys are closest together, is also during a time when you see the most increase in average cranial capacity, so average brain size for population. So it seems like big brains in humans are serving as part of our kind of adaptive repertoire for dealing with climate unpredictability, with habitat unpredictability, with unpredictability of food. We also, during this time, you get the advent of using fire for making more food available. You get the advent of much more complex cultural forms in which hominins are using culture to adapt to this unpredictability. All right, the next video will be on the skull.